Hi, this is Paul. Just today, Tom Holland, an interview with Tom Holland from Lockdown TV from Unheard dropped, and it's a terrific interview, and I want to do some commentary on it, so let's go. Now, with my last video, when I did a commentary, and I've always had issues with sound with commentary, so I've had to do editing and things like that, hopefully to get the sound better than I have been. So hopefully this won't be an issue here. Tom Holland's been sort of on a Christmas roll. He has a podcast, which I think is very interesting. Tom Holland is in some ways the historian, however you want to categorize the current wave needs. And he says some things in this video that are absolutely Jordan Peterson-esque, even though if you go back and look at my interview with Tom Holland, he barely knew who Jordan Peterson was when I talked to him. So let's jump into this. The whole video is outstanding. I'm going to play most of it and comment on most of it probably. Hopefully no technical glitches. Right away it doesn't start. Here we go.
Is a sort of Christian festival in Western democracies like the one we're living in. Do you sense that?
Well, I mean, I think that anxiety about that is in itself a very Christian tradition. So it essentially, I mean, interestingly, in the early centuries, so early medieval period, scholars like Bede, great Anglo-Saxon scholar, is completely unconcerned by the echoes of the pagan.
Now this is something really interesting for me, because when he said this, I've read some of the Venerable Bede, and he's a very interesting writer. And when he said this, I thought, wow, has Tom read much C.S. Lewis? Because C.S. Lewis is in some ways the strangest saint for a lot of evangelical Christians, because evangelicals can tend to be really hyper about paganism, and C.S. Lewis was and he wasn't. And the way he was and he wasn't revealed sort of a high resolution view on. Lewis was, of course, a medievalist, and the large work he did, what he called the Ohel, the English this English work on medieval literature from the 16th century. I mean, that's what Lewis did. And so Tom Holland is picking this up, but he's not getting it from Lewis. He's getting it from reading the primary sources, where, of course, Lewis got it from. And so to sort of get, and this, I think, this is why this current movement is in many ways a continuation of the process that got started in the Protestant Reformation. And we're working through, sort of in the words of Jordan Hall, we're working through some of the deep code here to figure out, okay, how does this world work? And the Protestant Reformation, the Enlightenment, grab at certain answers, and now we're in a position where some of those institutions and answers are weaker, and so we take a step back and say, okay, how does the Christian and the classical and the pre-Christian really relate? And again, if you do any reading in the Protestant period, so much of that is trying to get an assessment, because the Renaissance, in so many ways, the Renaissance sets the table for the Protestant Reformation, and it's all this grappling with these sorts of things
in Christian celebration. So not just Christmas, but also Easter, which Bede says is named after a pagan goddess. He's not worried about this because it proves the triumph of Christianity over this pagan dispensation. There is no issue with the fact for Bede that Christmas is celebrated in the depths of winter as pagans have celebrated it, because for Bede, the pagan celebrations in winter are just a kind of pallid foreshadowing of the truth of Christ's birth. And so therefore echoes of pagan,
It wasn't.
that is so C.S. Lewis. That is C.S. Lewis. That is Tolkien. That's how they dealt with this question of Christian versus the classical period. And again, this is how Tom Holland has come into this. So in many ways, he's sort of following in Lewis's footsteps.
An echo so much as a sort of
yes,
advance
a kind
notice.
of a foreshadowing.
Yeah.
But by the time you get to the Reformation, in England, and you get Puritans in particular are very, very anxious about the way in which they see the Roman Church as having failed to root up the brambles and nettles of paganism. And worse, in many ways, they think that...
So they see all of the sort of angels and the Virgin Mary and all of these kind of other seeming deities are complexify the sort of relationship between individual and...
Now, Tom is about to correct him here, but the fact that he went there is completely indicative of where the Enlightenment went, because notice that the questioner here cut the line at, let's say, the natural supernatural boundary where secularism reaches it, but notice that Holland won't, and so this working through the boundaries and divisions of things is what exactly does the Protestant Reformation complain about? Now, obviously, it sort of hems in the canon back to Scripture, and of course a tiny little bit smaller Scripture, but it's so fascinating that the questioner here drew the line where he did, and now Holland's going to come in and correct.
God, is that what
they're not
upset
worried
about?
about the angels, and they're not worried about the Virgin Mary because that's in Scripture, and Protestants are very keen on Scripture. You know, you go to Scripture basically to know what's proper. It's all the other accretions. So it's the saints certainly, but also the general sense that at Christmas the tradition of open house, of offering hospitality to people, of giving presents, all of which it seems to me clearly derived, and you can see this in the kind of early medieval traditions. So there's this tradition of generosity at Christmas that absolutely arises from the kind of imperatives of the way that Christians understand their duty to the poor.
Puritans didn't like it.
Now, again, it is so interesting because the questioner here he's doing what a good questioner should do. He is anticipating the questions on the minds of the audience. And so notice it's the natural supernatural line. It's the sort of the hot take on what a Protestant is. Now, again, I really recommend the podcast on Christmas, and that's going to be an equal opportunity offender with some of my audience here. And this will get into where Tom Holland will go later in the video when the interviewer decides to pursue the question of Tom Holland's personal faith. This interview is so interesting on so many different levels. This is now my new favorite interview, at least since the Delling-Pod interview.
But I think by the time you get to the 17th century, this sense has been blurred, and Puritans read about the way that the Romans celebrated their gods.
Because now remember, the Protestant Reformation gets up to speed on the heels of the Renaissance, and Erasmus and others drag out ancient texts, at least the ones available to them. And the printing press is making more and more texts available. And they start to compare the Vulgate with the Greek texts that they have at hand. Again, you can read a lot of this in the wonderful book, Fatal Discord. And so, in a sense, Erasmus sets the table for Luther, and Luther takes it to places that Erasmus never wants to go. So that's all, of course, in the 16th century. Now you get into the 17th century, and so much more stuff has been on the move, and that's going to set up the 18th century, of course. So things are really getting up to speed in the 17th century, and you're going to get someone yesterday asked me about the Heidelberg Catechism and the Belgic Confession and the Canons of Dort, and I noted how the difference between the Canons of Dort and the Heidelberg Catechism and the Belgic Confession are quite crucial. The Canons of Dort are coming at a very different time, and the kinds of issues that the Canons of Dort is preoccupied about is very different from the kinds of issues that you find. That Guido de Bray and the preoccupation in the Belgic Confession is are Protestants Christians, and would the emperor please relent in killing us? No, he will not. If we make a claim, a theological claim for Christianity, and of course the Heidelberg Catechism is set there to replace the Roman Catholic Catechism as the main instrument for catechizing Christian youth and bringing people into the church. And so what gets going now in the 17th century with the Protestants is many of the anxieties of the Reformers are still there, because the Reformers and the Reformation is still a live cause, and the anti-Catholicism is obviously a live cause, and in many ways in England this stuff gets cooked up hotter than it does in, let's say, the Netherlands or Switzerland. And
and they draw the analogies, and they're nervous that actually these celebrations are being held not for Christian reasons but for pagan reasons. And it's the Puritans really who are the first people to draw up this thesis that Christian celebrations derive from the pagan.
Now this is fascinating, because video after video on YouTube in terms of the sport between atheists and Christians, that's the charge made by the atheist. Your Christian celebrations are just remanufactured pagan holidays. And notice how C.S. Lewis sort of, takes all the energy of that and turns it around in his book Miracles, for example, says, yes, of course they are. That is exactly what they are. They're just higher resolution. All of those were dreams of the world. And I think about Jordan Peterson in his first biblical series trying to describe what is it that's bubbling up from the poets and the artists. They're sort of dreams. And what comes in Christ is the myth made true, the myth made flesh.
They're not much fun, these Puritans of the 17th century, are they? How close to cancelling Christmas did they get?
Okay. I think that is the stereotype. And although Cromwell didn't cancel Christmas, this was the prohibition against Christmas festivities long preceded him in the kind of the early days of the Civil War from Parliament. The idea that Cromwell and the Protectorate consisted of people rushing around, stopping people having fun, cancelling everything, is absolutely a stereotype that continues to have enormous play, and I think has a kind of political resonance even to this day, because I think that I think a huge reason why the government is so determined not to cancel Christmas, to allow people to have this kind of brief window of fun, is that they don't want to be cast as Cromwell. They don't want to be kind of cast as finger-wagging Puritans.
I think this is when I talked to Tom Holland in my interview, he talked about the fact that he had a number of projects he was working on, but one of the things he really wanted to work on is a history of the 60s. And if you listen to his podcast, he does his podcast with a historian who does some very interesting work in the history of the 60s. And so now we have these governments that, whereas let's say before the 60s, governments didn't mind embodying the authority, the old, the father authority. Now we want our presidents to go on late night TV and yuck it up. And no, we don't. Governments are all about fun, because fun is good for. Just amazing to watch these things come and go back and forth.
And stopping people having fun. But I think equally, one of the fascinations of this strangest of Christmases is that actually it does bring you quite close to what the Puritans are worried about, because just as people now who want to really rein in Christmas are doing it for the best of reasons, they were doing it because they think that it will save lives and it will be for the good of society as a whole. That's exactly the motivation of the Puritans. Puritans want to cancel Christmas not because they want to have fun. Cromwell was a great enthusiast for music and for dancing. I mean, he was aware that the good things in life are good, but Puritans were anxious that celebrating Christmas as they saw it in a pagan way would doom those who did it to eternal death. And
So they were worried.
Now, this is where secularity gets very interesting because, of course, the Puritans are painting on a far larger canvas. And once you restrict the canvas within sort of the iron box of the secular, where, we have no knowledge outside of the, before conception or birth or after death, and there's no heaven, and so now all this must be confined here. And this is why I've talked about before about the fact when you try to bring down heaven, you pull up hell. The secular frame intensifies, and of course Miroslav Volf writes about that in his experiences in the deconstruction of Yugoslavia after the fall of communism, where now if you have sort of an afterlife and a God who judges perfectly in all of this, your enemies will face the judgment of God. And of course, this judgment also says, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, I will repay. And so, okay, let God repay. I don't have to get blood on my hands. But if you no longer have that broader canvas in order to paint the story upon, what we see in the secular frame is an intensification, because all condemnation and all reward and pleasure must fit into this little frame of a biologically limited human life. And so in this way, you get strange heirs of the Puritans, whereas the Puritans are very concerned about the eternal damnation and the souls of the people. Well, now, we must preserve all of these lives at all cost, and obviously the cost of that is going to put pressure and might even be the thing that finally exhausts humanism, where life, once again, as it did in the ancient world, gets very cheap.
For their spiritual health rather
absolutely.
than their physical health.
But it's about health in both cases. It's about a desire to, not needlessly see people lost to death. And I think that the experience of this Christmas perhaps enables us to have a kind of sense of where the Puritans were coming from in a kind of a more emotive way than perhaps we've had for centuries.
I mean, it is an amazing parallel. The Puritans didn't have social media, but had they, one can sort of imagine that they would have been quite militant on social media and quite quick to judge and to prosecute virtue in the kind of public square.
Now, if you listen to Holland, I think it was on his podcast where he talks about Luther. Luther killed it in his social media of his day because, of course, the printing press was new, and it's the pamphlets and it's the woodcuts, and those were the social media. And Luther just, see, I'm getting Holland confused with this book that Holland mentioned in one of his, I think it was in his podcast, a book on, or maybe it was on his Twitter stream, I don't know, but this on the book on the Reformations. I mean, Luther would have killed it on Twitter.
Should we look at those people who are most sort of censorious and moral high groundish today, most clear, most black and white about what is right and wrong, and most kind of comfortable judging others as today's Puritans?
Well, you say that the Puritans didn't have social media, but they particularly after the outbreak of the Civil War, and then even more with the...
That's the English Civil War, not the American Civil War. But even so, if you read Neil Postman or you look at the struggles in the run-up to the American Civil War, if you look at Kansas, bleeding Kansas... smashing printing presses was what you wanted to do to silence your adversaries. And, Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin was sort of this weapon of mass slavery destruction in the American culture war of the middle of the 19th century surrounding slavery.
The abolition of the monarchy. You do have a kind of liberation of the printing presses, and so pamphlets do absolutely churn out. So kind of, it's kind of the 17th century equivalent of social media. Suddenly all kinds of people are able to communicate and have expressed their views in ways that they were not able to previously. And I guess that as today on Twitter or Facebook, of course, it's the people who feel strongest about issues who tend to be most active, and it's those whose views perhaps are the starkest, are the most sharply defined, that are able to express themselves with the most.
But do you think the Puritan comparison is fair? I mean, it sort of feels like there's always been some type of personality that quite almost enjoys a kind of clarity of purpose that comes with moral condemnation.
Now, part of what makes this interview really fun is the interviewer is so voicing the zeitgeist. No, isn't it psychology? Isn't it personality spectrum? And of course it is. But would we really want to compare today's anxious Christmas cancelers with the Puritans? And I think Holland nails it here.
Yes.
Were they the same people in Cromwell's day? Do you think that now they're just wearing different clothes and worrying about different issues?
I think so. I mean,
and that observation too, the same people. Now we're into identity. Now we're into, well, what am I? They're the same people today. Well, what on earth do you mean by that? They're not the same biological organisms. It's the same spirit that moves them, but there's a world of difference between the 17th century and the 21st century. But it's the same spirit that moves them, or it's an analogous spirit, or it's fascinating.
I think that to the degree that a feeling of moral superiority can be a source of pleasure, that's clearly true. But I think that in both cases it's reductive to assume that that is all it's about, because just as today lots of people are motivated to take a moral stand on social media by deeply held principles, the same is absolutely true of Puritans, who in many ways are the kind of the most, I find them kind of very moving, most movingly introspective of people, because to be a Puritan is constantly to look into your soul and to ask yourself, am I measuring up? Am I fallen? Am I redeemed? Have I received grace? And you kind of have to, unless, you can judge others and you can judge society, but you can only do that if you are also judging yourself constantly.
It takes a lot to be a good Puritan.
Yes, it does. Absolutely, it does. And I think that at its most admirable, you see the same thing on social media today, that there are, of course, all kinds of blowhards. There are all kinds of hypocrites. There are all kinds of people who enjoy the sound of their own voice. And I'm sure that is true now as it was in the 17th century. But equally, there are people who examine themselves with great care and kind of are concerned to do the best that they can. And I think that is also a part of it. And I think that just as in the 17th century, if you take it seriously, if you take these anxieties seriously, then actually you can gain a great deal from it. Same is true today. I mean, you've just got to...
At what point does that same instinct...
It's interesting that the video was edited there, because we're gonna transition to the woke now, and you can... Antifa and some of the wokesters go off one edge, but some of the anti-woke, they go off another edge. And, your mother who's reading Facebook, and your cousin, and these people in your family who are just trying to be better people by not being racist or sexist or mean to people with different sexual orientations. There's a good thing down there at heart, and they're trying, and they might not have a lot of experience with people different from themselves, and so they hear the chatter and they want to sort of line up on the right side of history and do the right thing, and that in and of itself is not a bad thing. And just like with Tom Holland's observation here, and again, back when I started paying attention to the rise of the ascendant morality, it's there's some good motivations at heart. You just have to begin to ask some much more nuanced and deeper questions in terms of, well, what exactly, do a little bit of theological reflection. Well, what exactly is the method of salvation here? Does this in fact become sort of a self-salvationism that sets in with this, and what is the telos? What is the goal that this new morality is heading towards? But I think Tom Holland's perspective here is exactly right.
Which is a virtuous one and can be an incredibly rewarding one for society, flip into becoming a point. Does that same instinct, which is a virtuous one and can be an incredibly rewarding one for society, flip into becoming a tyrannical instinct? I mean, if we look at, the protectorate ended and life came back with double vigor. The Prohibition era of the 20s was followed by partying and everybody celebrating. This year, at least more than any time in my lifetime, has felt a little bit like that suddenly the whole of society is gripped by rules and fears, and moral judgment is everywhere. And I wonder whether there's a sort of coiled spring effect, that when it's finally over, life will come back double.
I'm sure there is. I mean, I'm sure that the vast majority of people must be yearning to get back to normality. And I would have thought that purely looking at it economically, there must be vast amounts of cash kind of frozen in accounts that people who've kept their jobs haven't been able to spend.
This might sound like a reach now, and you can stop me if you think I'm trying to make too grand sweeps of history here, but your book, Dominion, is all about the Christian inheritance, and how the final chapter of it is called Woke. You point that these kind of instincts have sort of morphed in through liberalism and secularism through to where we are today. And it just seems almost ironic that the voices now who are most vociferously in favour of cancelling Christmas, literally, I mean, that's been a phrase that everyone's tabloid newspapers have been putting on their front pages for decades and has never actually been true, but this year it sort of is true. Those voices are perhaps animated by a spirit that derives from Christianity.
I think so, and I think it kind of comes in various traditions. So I think there is a kind of Puritan strain, kind of Protestantism that...
And I think, again, this is where we get into the Christendom Civil War.
Has in many ways been bled of God, but retains the sense of moral earnestness. And I think a lot of, particularly on the left, that strain of moral Puritanism, and I use Puritanism, not as a pejorative, I think absolutely animates it. But I think also another strain is the way in which a concern for the sick has been an enduring Christian tradition. And it's Christians really who established the idea that you should have kind of mass healthcare. Hospitals that are in which people care for the sick, no matter how rich or poor they are, is an inheritance that we in the modern welfare state have received from Christianity. And in fact, there's a sense in which the welfare state, and particularly the National Health Service, is a nationalisation of responsibilities that the churches previously exercised. And I think
in the video, the commentary, and again, you'll notice some of the things that I'm working on here. I'm doing things a little bit differently because I'm trying to get the sound right. And so sorry about the volumes up and down, but hopefully over time I'll get better at this. I try not to spend too much time having to learn all the technical things. But notice the video that I did about Jordan Hall's deep code. The state in many ways, one of the interesting themes, if you look through the history of the West, is the constant dance between church and state and as institutions. And of course, Holland has done more work on this than most, because again, the point I made before, Pontius, well, this is a title of a Roman emperor, and then it becomes the title of the Christian pope. So what is the relationship between prophet, priest, and king? And one way to understand the history of the West, now, why did I mention prophet, priest, and king? Well, that comes up in the Heidelberg Catechism. Well, those are the three offices of Christ, and a conversation broke out in the Discord as to, well, what about the separation of church and state? And it's very interesting watching the new rise of interest in orthodoxy and watching people begin to critique this separation of church and state that has been a hallmark of Protestantism. And again, reading this book that I should probably put the link to the book in the comments that I'm reading about reformations. If there's one thing that happens in the Reformation that happens around Luther, it's the continued working through of these questions of the boundaries between church and state. And one of Holland's themes, and one of the things that he notices, is that in many ways states have taken over things from churches. Now, do they better belong to state, or do they better belong to church? And how do you make those? How do you figure out how that dance should come about?
I think that is why one of the things that I've noticed over the course of this year is actually how absent the churches have been. In previous experiences of pandemic, they played very, very central roles.
Now, Tom Holland did a conversation on Unbelievable with Justin Brierley and another person about this. And this has fascinated Holland for a while, and he's going to talk about it a little bit here and repeat some of the stuff that he said there. But to me, part of what he's doing, he's right on that question, and this question gets into the meaning crisis and all of these other conversations that we're having about agency. Because, well, why? Churches in modernity have sort of been pushed into a corner, and there's sort of a split that happens, that physical things the state will be in charge of, and spiritual things the church will be in charge of. And this separation, again, this separation and addressing this separation was, so the intuitive side of me, when I first started listening to Jordan Peterson, noticed that separation, and my pastoral side knew that this separation was deeply involved in people's transformations as Christians, or their lack of fruit in transformation as Christians. And we're always dealing with it, because people go to the doctor to deal with what they can, and they go to the pastor to deal with what they can't with the doctor. Now, again, I just, in fact, got off the phone praying for a woman who is going into surgery tomorrow, and I'm, pre-COVID, visiting members of my church when they go into the hospital, and I pray for their healing. But all of these issues, we just revolve around them in modernity, around and around. And so it's fascinating that this is what clearly sticks in Holland's intuitive mind, and in successive interviews. Now, he's been talking about this for a little while. He's written about it. This is what he's working on. Okay. He's working on all of this same stuff that we've been working on in the meaning crisis, and Jordan Peterson and John Vervaeke and Jonathan Peugeot and Sevilla King and her work on Persig and Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance. It's all this question of how do heaven and earth connect? And again, like Jordan Peterson, he looks at the church and finds it wanting. But he also looks at other institutions and finds them wanting. And it's right here in the middle that Holland intuitively focuses on. And I think that's what drew me to him in these conversations.
That role over the course of this pandemic has essentially been played by the health service. Churches literally closed their doors.
Out of interest, is that the first time that's happened?
I think since the interdict, to be honest.
The interdict.
So King John,
sort of
his bust up with Innocent III in the first part of the 13th century.
A long time ago.
A long time ago, when the Pope stopped services going on. So I think, So I think that's been a real feature of this, is that the churches have basically been kind of absent from the discourse.
And now here in America, where you've got all kinds of crazy politics going on about this, because of course, even though America got rid of the king, okay, And that's important in this because, well, the Queen, she's the head of the Church of England. And so, at least formally in many ways, England is a Christian country. Even though there's religious liberty, England is a Christian country, and there's a state church. And of course, all of these things, there's been modulations over these things for a very long time now. In America, right from the states had their churches, but the federal government, the United States, didn't have their church. And now here in California, for example, some judge ruled that strip clubs could stay open as an essential service, and the churches were like, hey, and of course the Babylon Bee had a field day with that. And hey, if you're going to let strip clubs open, you have to let the church be open. If you're going to let the churches be open, you have to let the restaurants be open. And suddenly the whole line between essential services, well, you know, the government said churches were non-essential, and some churches sort of laid down like nice little lapdogs and say, oh, whatever you say. And other churches said, hey, wait a minute. We're the most essential, and everybody looks at them like they're an anachronism. But again, right here is where this is going on, and Holland just goes right there, and that to me is so instructive.
And so public devotion, you might even call it superstition, has been focused on the National Health Service. So as you walk around London, I've seen in windows.
Right, the National Health Service becomes the church. That is, and the doctors are the ones. And this gets back to my conversation about miracles and placebo. Is placebo a miracle? And someone wrote in that comment on Vervaeke's posting of that conversation, placebos even work in pets. And I thought, now that's interesting. If it's true, I don't know, but. These are these folds, these nexus points where we're trying to really get at, okay, what is real and what is reality made of?
You know, all the kind of the rainbow drawings, the slogans, the expressions of gratitude to the National Health Service. You know, we've had our rituals going out and applauding in the evenings and so on. And
in another century, that might have been. They might have been saints in the windows, and they might have been songs on the doors.
But also the role played by people who were motivated by overtly Christian instincts, and so the sense of a gratitude that we feel now for health service workers was kind of bound up with a sense of gratitude towards representatives of the church who were doing the same, and so I think that in a sense. Because those responsibilities have been siphoned off from the churches, they've come to seem less relevant in this experience of pandemic. Perhaps
not just because they were siphoned off, but what is relevance? Relevance realization. What is relevant? Is the medical relevant or the prayer relevant? Is the hospitals are essential services? They're going to get the vaccines. Are pastors essential services? Schools, they're essential, but are, you know, is this religious stuff essential? No, because again, this is implicitly materialist. It's from the ground up, and this is the basis of reality. All this church stuff, well, that's sort of basically, you know, when we first started doing YouTube, the default listing on YouTube for we were streaming, and Rick, who I was streaming with, he just left the default, which was entertainment. I said, well, let's make it at least education and not entertainment. But entertainment is in fact where religion is relegated, and apparently slightly less essential than your sex workers.
They did in previous one.
And without wishing to draw you into kind of hot water politically, the Archbishop, Justin Welby, is actually quite a neat exemplar of the kind of modern Christian in that respect, because his impulse has been to be sort of maximally obedient to those concerns, to police almost the safety requirements, keep a low profile. It's a
denominational bureaucrats are often just like that.
Sort of almost a stepping back, a self-abasement instinct. I don't know if how should we interpret his role and the kind of Church of England more specifically?
Well, I think that
he's very politically correct.
I think the risk for the churches, and particularly the Church of England, because, you know, it's the established church, is that with so many of its traditional responsibilities and roles taken over by various aspects of the state, the risk for the churches is that they come to seem like a kind of eccentric and not very important sub-department of the welfare state.
Bingo.
And I agree. I think that the role played by archbishops and bishops in particular, the messages that they were giving were basically public health messages. Yeah. So that's what they were doing. But actually, if the church is to play a distinctive role, that's inadequate because.
And again, this is a Jordan Peterson moment, because he who is, well, to the degree that, when we're going to get a little bit later, where Tom Holland, to the degree that he is or isn't inside or outside the church, here he's critiquing the church, and he's seeing the church clearly. He's seeing the impotence of the church, the irrelevance of the church, how the church is sort of pushed over to the side. Again, I think about Andrew Root's excellent books where he sort of gives us Charles Taylor, pre-chewed Charles Taylor, and applies it to pastors and churches. This is where the conversation is.
So we've got professors of public health, we've got epidemiologists, we've got doctors, we've got endless people. Yeah, of course. As you know better than anyone, there are so many people who are kind of better qualified to talk about this than bishops. That really, it's a kind of what's the point of them if that's what they're going to do? And the point of them.
Exactly. What's the point of them? What's the point of the bishop? What's the point of any of this? And why do churches die? Because people basically say, what's the point? I had a conversation, this is where conservative churches have a little bit of an advantage, because they continue to at least make the point that there is a point, whereas increasingly the churches that align themselves with secularity and the government, well, there is no point. And maybe church is sort of a social club where we go and do fun things, but the hospital, that's where the real action is.
Must be, if you're a Christian, that they're there to ultimately, in a state where you don't have anything else to do, to talk about all the kind of weird stuff that Christians believe. The idea that there is a kind of purpose to this, that there's a dimension that lies beyond the merely physical, that all the stuff that traditionally the churches have talked about, but which now they all seem slightly embarrassed about.
But that's and again, he just nails it. And this, again, I think is why Tom and Jordan Peterson have been so helpful to me, because they're just saying what everyone has been thinking. And churches haven't been able to, or pastors haven't been able to articulate, well, what exactly is it that we do? We're still doing it, and we go through the motions, but does it really matter? Does it really count? And then, of course, you've got churches come in, Frank Peretti with This Present Darkness comes in with a whole new story that now gives it. And we're going to get into story now in just a minute here.
It's so important, because I've certainly felt that this year, that the one kind of universally agreed upon moral has been life or death. And all of our public decisions have been structured around that.
Physical life and death, okay? Material. This is the playing out of naturalism. This is the telos. This is where naturalism leads. What is most important is life or death. Now, we've still, again, as Tom Holland noted, we've got humanism, which is sort of Christianity light floating around. And so, we should really kind of keep people alive. Lives and death are at stake, but then when it comes to rationing, then we're going to probably start getting pragmatic and say, these lives are worth more than these other lives over here.
And it's a pretty good one. I think, most people would sign up to that. I would rather people survived than didn't. It just really laid bare to me how there aren't very many other virtues that are publicly sayable or that people widely agree on anymore.
That are publicly sayable. This video, it nails so much.
And what is the value of what kind of life people are living. What is the value of beauty, of togetherness, of relationships, of,
The meaning crisis is all over this little speech he's giving.
If someone who is in their 80s lives for 9 months but is able to be with their family and have a beautiful spiritual life versus
there's the word spiritual. It's all right here.
living for 12 months being stuck on their own in an elderly care home without being able to see anyone. How should we judge those two scenarios? And it's been amazingly absent.
And Civilis wades in and says, value. There it is, Persig, value.
Yeah.
For me, and maybe that's something that Christians could have done a better job.
Well, I wonder whether
maybe the Christians sort of from the aisles would say, we've got an idea. You have an idea? Yeah, we've got an idea. And then they say something and that doesn't sound very good.
Paul describes Christians as being like athletes.
He just says Paul. He doesn't say the Apostle Paul. He doesn't locate Paul. He's talking to, Holland has been reading so much and doing so much. He just comes right out with Paul. Paul of Tarsus, Apostle Paul. No, just Paul, first name basis here.
That you have to compete, you have to train like an athlete. And I wonder whether the mere fact over the past few decades that life in the West has been so easy that we haven't kind of really faced massive existential crises in the way that we have this year, whether the church is like so many, like all the rest of us, in a sense, have kind of become unprepared for these kinds of crises.
Affluenzia, we're fat and lazy.
Because ultimately, whether you're a Christian or not, whether you admire Christianity or not, the simple historical fact is that of all the...
now he's about to lip sync Jordan Peterson.
The ways that humanity, over the course of its history, has devised to explain why we're here, what humanity is for, how we relate to the cosmos beyond. Of all those attempts to explain it, Christianity is historically the most successful. And that success must be founded in an ability to provide satisfying answers to the profoundest questions. Why are we here? Why do we die? Why do we suffer? Is there life in death? Is there light in darkness? Is there redemption from suffering? All these kind of questions are fundamental to the Christian message. And I would have thought that there is an opportunity there for the churches to kind of examine these questions.
And we didn't. And we stumbled. And we failed. Why? Because we didn't know the answers ourselves. We didn't live out those answers. And right at the beginning of the pandemic, people are like, oh, Christians didn't flee the plagues. Oh, okay. Well, there's a factoid. Well, what does that mean? Because the world has changed. And, well, we've got tools about the plagues. We've got germ theories and so on and so forth. But it just shows the general fumbling with respect to the times we live in. Now, that little speech right there, we got to play it again.
Over the course of its history, has devised to massive existential crises in the way that we have this year. Whether the church is like so many, like all the rest of us, in a sense, have kind of become unprepared for these kinds of crises, because ultimately, whether you're a Christian or not, whether you admire Christianity or not, the simple historical fact is that of all the ways that humanity, over the course of its history, has devised to explain why we're here, what humanity is for, how we relate to the cosmos beyond. Of all those attempts to explain it, Christianity is historically the most successful. And that success must be founded in an ability to provide satisfying answers to the profoundest questions. Why are we here? Why do we die? Why do we suffer? Is there life in death? Is there light in darkness? Is there redemption from suffering? All these kind of questions are fundamental to the Christian message. And I would have thought that there is an opportunity there for the churches to kind of examine these questions, perhaps in a more public and effective manner than.
Bang! Right there, right there, right there.
I'm aware that I may well be being very unfair here, because I know that there are plenty of people in all of the churches who have spoken.
And now, not just answer, because that's very Protestant of us, but live out, incarnate, to manifest it in our lives to a degree. Now, the manifestation of that lives in and he's right, it's people who are doing this. They're just not necessarily on the news. They just not necessarily gotten around, or people don't see them, because we're all looking at, well, what are we looking at? We're all looking at what is relevant to us.
Spoken very powerfully about precisely these questions and issues, but they don't. It doesn't seem to have been people that the leaders of the church. They don't seem to have seized whatever platforms they might have.
It's not the leaders of the church, the shepherds. Read Jeremiah or Ezekiel about the shepherds, the shepherds who fail the sheep. They feed off the sheep, but they don't lead the sheep.
Have been given, and in fact, the exception that proves the rule to that for me is the Pope, back in April, celebrating a mass in a kind of empty.
See Mary Cohen's video about the new nativity scene at the Vatican?
Socially distanced St. Peter's Square, against a backdrop of the sirens of people taking people to hospital, clanging of bells, and he stopped and prayed before an icon that had come to Rome from Constantinople. It kind of opened up, I think, a sense of the richness and the depth of this Christian tradition. You know, just how much wealth, spiritual wealth, emotional wealth, moral wealth there is in this incredible tradition of people trying to make sense of these questions. You know, and it's a kind of continuum for 20 centuries. But this does not seem to me to have been perhaps the year in which
the moment of apocalypse came and the church revealed nothing.
Hasn't come to the fore.
Yeah.
You're a Christian?
I wrote Dominion basically because I lost my faith quite early, and essentially became a convert to the Greek gods probably when I was about 8. And essentially, over the past 20 years, while writing about particularly the pre-Christian world of Greece and Rome, I came to feel more and more that morally and ethically I was in fact incredibly Christian. And that's really what I wanted to explore in it, was the degree to which, almost and almost paradoxically in a way, that that the loss of faith in God is itself expressed kind of in Christian terms, that the absence that you have is shaped by Christianity.
The loss of faith in God is expressed in Christian terms. Now, there's some René Girard in there, especially when you think, okay, what is it? What do you mean by God? What do you mean by faith in God? And what Holland brings out, I was chatting on Twitter with someone who I've had on the channel before, and he made the point after reading he made the point to me, we were discussing Bishop Barron's critique of dominion. He made the point to me that, well, there's a lot of Paul in Tom Holland. You know, does Jesus shine through? And I think that's a good question. But what Tom Holland really gets at is the movement within the Barfieldian polarities. Boy, if you're not listening to my videos, you're not going to understand what I just said there. But this movement where Jesus basically continues to move up and down between heaven and earth. And he says radical things like, it's not what you put in your mouth that makes you holy or unholy. It's what comes out of your heart. Boy, that sounds very Protestant. But Jesus also says things like, I'm not here to get away, to destroy Moses, but to fulfill Moses. And so Jesus sort of perfectly straddles heaven and earth and brings heaven and earth together. And again, listening to Mary, this morning I just listened to Mary Cohen's video about the Vatican Nativity and Tom Bombadil. And I think, what Mary is really teaching me, she's really teaching me Catholicism. What Mary is really teaching me about, is some of the rich traditions within the church of how the world is knit together. And it makes me reflect on why the Protestant Reformation arose in the way that it did. And of course, Lewis's critique is right. This is probably something that should have happened, among good friends over pints and a smoke-filled room to sort of discuss the philosophies of this. But to push back on Lewis, it must be prosecuted in the world in a sense, because we all live out the elements of these spirits and we work them out together. And so, but again, right here, Tom Holland sort of gets right here in the crease between right here in the crease of the Protestant Reformation, and he knows where the line is, and so he watches the going back and forth over the line constantly, and the Pauline way in which Paul does this to talk about the life of the Spirit and the vibrations between heaven and earth, where we're always trying to get that balance just right, which of course comes in Christ, who is right there. It's the Word made flesh and dwelt among us. And of course, the reason the Bible just keeps pointing to him is because there it is. It's the, Mary said in that video how, it quotes G.K. Chesterton, that man, the man is feminine, and Mary, in a sense, in terms of the incarnation, is exactly the meeting of heaven and earth, and the product of that is Christ. So we're focusing in on right there the inflection points,
and that if that lack of belief in God is transmuted into something in which you, as a positive, then Richard Dawkins is always described as kind of an evangelical atheist, and evangelism.
I don't feel that at this point I can't not share this meme with you that came up in the Bridges of Meming Discord server. Someone named the Prophet Zacharias continues to just put out memes like crazy. And so here we have Richard Dawkins, playing the flute as the elves leave Middle Earth, and Arwen looks at him. And of course, if you watch the movie, of course, that Arwen will turn around and go back and live with Aragorn. And the little quip in the meme is the elves, it is said, have the most beautiful music. But again, Tom Holland here simply nails what's going on with Richard Dawkins. He's a Protestant evangelist of this certain form of extreme Protestantism that is atheism, where God sort of floats up and leaves. Deism is sort of halfway there, and if God isn't doing anything down here below, let's just get rid of the fella.
Is euangelion, it's good news. That's what Paul and the apostles preached, and Dawkins essentially is in that sense he is an evangelist. He's saying that if you topple idols, if you purge yourself of superstition, if you come out of the darkness into the light, then you will gain salvation, you will gain redemption. And this is a message that clearly, Dawkins seems to me very Protestant figure. This is very much in the mainstream of Protestantism, but Protestantism in turn is part of the broader Christian tradition, which goes back to, you get these same ideas in the way that the missionaries in the early medieval period are going into the dripping forests of Saxony to spread the word. And ultimately it goes back to the Hebrew prophets and their condemnation of the idols of Babylon and Egypt.
Well, not just the condemnation of the idols in Babylon, not just the iconoclasm of the Hebrew prophets, but it's the broadening of the covenant. It's obedience, not sacrifices, the prophets say. And so when Jesus comes fulfilling it, remember, prophet, priest, and king, Jesus comes as king, and in, so he's there's a little bit of Christian pastor here. He enters Jerusalem as king, Hosanna, son of David, and he's lifted up on the cross in the priestly role as sacrifice, but his teaching is in the prophetic office. And so the Hebrew prophets do this and say, okay, you have to understand what the temple is for. And Jeremiah, of course, says the temple can't save you. You cannot wield the material things of God and have leverage over him. And in some ways, deep in the Protestant Reformation, that's what they're saying. You cannot simply wield the sacrament and put God in your debt and force God into this or that. And so in that sense, there's a deeply prophetic element to the Protestant Reformation. And what we see in some ways with the new atheist is in continuity with that, but all the way to the extreme where, well, they're marching the elves out of Middle Earth because there's no reason to be here.
As stock and stone.
But you're not quite a Dawkins figure here.
No, I'm not a Dawkins figure. So
are you as you celebrate Christmas this year, do you do so in a believing Christian?
Right. So I came to realize basically that my atheism was a kind of subsection of Christianity, that it kind of related to Christianity, perhaps in the way that a thrush relates to the dinosaurs of the Mesozoic.
It's a great illustration. Again, I'm a preacher. I rip these things off. Got to hear that again.
It's part of it kind of related to Christianity, perhaps in the way that a thrush relates to the dinosaurs of the Mesozoic. That it's part of a kind of evolutionary continuum. And I guess that my experience of writing Dominion and reflecting on it, thinking about it over the years since, is that I've basically come to realize that all the things that I believe in, so human rights, the essential equality of human beings, the fact that there is a nobility in being human, that these are beliefs. It requires a leap of faith to believe in them. There's nothing kind of scientific or objective about any of these beliefs. And that I believe them because they stand in a line of inheritance from the Christian myth, which is ultimately a Jewish myth, that God created men and women equally in his own image, and that therefore human beings possess a particular dignity. And essentially my feeling is that if I'm going to believe in human dignity, then I might as well go full blown and believe the whole, all the stories. And I believe in it as a myth. I don't really believe in God. I don't really.
He is just Peterson all over the place. But again, it's not just Peterson and Tom Holland. I mean, these are the people I've been talking to. These are the people on Bridges of Meaning. The thing is, this living, straddling these two things like this is hard to maintain. And, rationality rules. Let's give him his due. That one video he had, you bring in people all the way up, and then folks are like, no, I really want to inhabit it fully. But there's reasons. And so this is why, if you listen to Tom Holland's Christmas podcast, some evangelicals, and boy, that gets back into a video they've been trying to make and haven't really succeeded in terms of it's this challenge for us because of our cultural prelude. Well, where is the crease sort of between the Bible and history? Well, when Tom Holland talks about history, that thing that Tom Holland does happened long after the Bible was written. Well, he said, well, didn't the people of the Bible know what happens in the physical world? Yeah. And I think this is exactly where C.S. Lewis puts his finger on it in his book Miracles, in the chapter Horrid Red Things. And I started making videos because I listened to Jordan Peterson and I thought he needs to read C.S. Lewis's book Miracles. And I thought, okay, I can fire on Amazon and somehow figure out a way to get this shipped to University of Toronto and get C.S. Lewis to read Miracles. But now having, even just a tiny little following, people send me books. It's like I tend to read the books that come up on my salience hierarchy. Not that your gifts are unappreciated, but that tends to be where I put my time, just like I'm constantly bombarded with video recommendations. And in fact, I found this video from a video recommendation from a woman that's visited my church a number of times and sort of found me on YouTube. And, that's how she kind of got connected with our church to the degree that she is. She's also a member of another church. But anyway, so, but C.S. Lewis has walked all through this. And so Tom Holland starts lip syncing C.S. Lewis, and then he starts lip syncing Jordan Peterson, and I'm thinking, there's a pattern here, and so right here in Horrid Red Things, that's really where this question of history and belief. And so when Tom Holland says, "Well, I don't really believe," and he's going to say more about that in a minute. Well, now we're back to Jordan Peterson. Well, what do you mean by believe?
I mean, I find it, if I think of it in those terms, if I sit down and think, do I believe, there's a God, and I think of the icy immensities of space, and I think of the icy immensities of time, I find it very difficult. But if I think, Christmas and Easter, basically
space and time. Now, again, if you talk to Richard Dawkins and Stephen Woodford and Sam Harris, in their imagination, God is a super thing. It's something within space and time. And again, if we go back to our friend Brett Sockold and the Jews, and this is, if you gosh, there are a number of reasons why my conversation with Tom Holland failed. Part of it was my earnest desire to get certain books into his head, my earnest desire to colonize him, and that's almost always the reason. Someone's earnest desire to colonize someone else is almost always the reason a conversation fails. But to get Kaufman and basically this Hebraic conception of God, because Holland is sort of right there, again, on that crease. And so many of you are on that crease. I mean, Poe is on that crease, Poe the person, and my conversation with her. And I know Esther has a problem with me using the LARPing metaphor, but that's basically what Holland is doing. And I would argue that belief follows practice, not the other way around.
The times where I do really believe it, because I can believe in it as a story. I can believe in it as a kind of poem, I suppose. And I realize that...
And now the irony of that perspective is, well, that's sort of the perspective of what churches are doing as entertainment, of non-essential services. And again, one of the things that each of us have to come to terms with is that we are not driving our boats. We are not in charge of ourselves. Our beliefs are not primarily volitional. We are the chattering rider on top of the elephant, and the elephant believes what it believes. And so, another fun, well, I'll have to pull up another meme that came up on the Bridges of Meming Discord server. And this one was made of Job, who's been on the channel. Of course, you can find Job's story on my channel. And Job did not intend to believe any of these things. And so just walking with Job on his journey, and someone memified it on the Bridges of Meaning, begins with Jordan Peterson. Psst, hey, kids, want to buy some meaning? Some meaning? And then Job looking up, no such thing as meaning. I like math. And 6 months later, I'm addicted to Christ. And pretty soon you're going to find yourself believing. It's the way this thing goes. And so when I look at Tom Holland, I think, you're not safe from him. And again, read C.S. Lewis's, why can't I think of it? Joy, his little autobiography, his little spiritual memoir, which has the dates horribly wrong. If you look at Surprised by Joy, it has the dates horribly wrong because Lewis was terrible with dates. But Tom Holland is the 21st century C.S. Lewis. But we're getting to watch it in video. And he didn't have Tolkien at his shoulder, kind of, and Eric Dyson sort of bringing him along, but it's happening.
That in a sense I'm culturally attuned to read it and believe in it if I operate on the level of the story, if that makes sense. It's kind of complex.
And he doesn't have Owen Barfield and having the Great War with Owen Barfield and in figuring out what this Protestant Hebrew prophet impulse is, going back and forth. Okay, what is a sacrament? And again, the sacraments are right there on the line, and we can't get them right. But as we up with resolution, we go a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right. And we can't nail it because it's a thing too big for us to hold. Okay, and that's in a sense what the Protestant Reformation gets right. It's that, no, you can't wield the sacrament. It's all gift, as is belief, as is trust, as is faith. That's all gift. You don't wield it. You don't create it. It's given to you. You say, well, I don't like the sound of that. Well, the rest of your life is that way too. You didn't ask to be born. You didn't ask for your genetic material. You didn't ask for the time and space that you live in. You didn't ask for any of that. It's all gift. It's all gift.
To explain, but that's why I think that, in a sense, dwelling on, do you believe in God, or do you think this, or do you think that, kind of misses the point, because I think the whole way through the 2,000 years of Christianity, actually, it's kind of replicated itself as memes, if you want to put it in those terms, that it's the stories that have been the key to its success, that even now, in a kind of a Europe where fewer and fewer people are going to church or even have any particular familiarity with Bible stories, nevertheless they have an incredibly potent ability to change the way that that history operates. So why did Angela Merkel let in 1 million people into Germany who were not Christian, who were not, who were from a very different cultural background? And I'm sure that the reason for that is the kind of the heft that the parable of the Good Samaritan has in the makeup of Merkel's Protestantism. I'm sure that the openness of people to refugees in Christian societies is crucially influenced by people's reflections on the Christmas story. The idea of Mary and Joseph having no room at the inn, and I think that.
So there's almost a kind of victory whether or not you believe it. You're sort of Christian whether you want to be or not,
yeah,
and it sounds like you're sort of.
Yeah, I think.
That calls for one of the other memes that came through. Cord put this one together and shared it with me. Of course, Jordan Peterson quite famously says to Sam Harris, "You can't not be a Christian, Sam, because you're still acting it out." And then Eric Weinstein, just on his most recent Portal, that was quite an episode. That was one of my favorite Portal episodes where Eric Weinstein lays some things out, but then at the end he addresses some of his IDW stuff and says basically about Sam, you can't not be IDW, Sam, because you're still acting it out. And poor Sam Harris thinks, well, I've got rationality and autonomy and I'm in charge of me. And it's like, that's a failure of category to understand what a human being is.
I think that
bowing to it.
It's a question of whether you go with the grain of these stories, and I find actually that going with the grain of them it makes me happier. I feel kind of more stable in what I believe by doing that, and actually it's
so much for new atheism.
It's kind of more poetic. It's more beautiful. In a way, it's kind of. More exciting to believe in things that are grounded in these kind of stories and in this sense of poetry and of kind of theological grandeur and mythology than it is just to believe in a set of abstract principles.
So this Christmas, this is my last question for you, Tom. This Christmas, after such a weird year, and it's going to be a weird Christmas, do you feel you'll be thinking differently in any way than you did last Christmas or in previous times? I mean, have the events of this year made you realize things
Of course, he's talking COVID. We'll see what Tom answers.
that you didn't before?
I feel certain fundamental things more powerfully. So, of course, I will not be celebrating Christmas with my parents as I've been planning to. And so, there are reflections on, death and potential bereavement that have been sharpened for me. But also, my wife is a midwife, and I've always been incredibly proud of what she does and the role that she plays, bringing life into the world. But of course, against the backdrop of this year, where there's been so much death, the sense of what she is doing has been heightened and sharpened, and particularly at Christmas, of course. So she'll be working on Christmas Day, thinking about the story of the Nativity, thinking about life in death, thinking about birth and the role that she plays in that. I feel that my appreciation for her is definitely sharpened. It has a kind of an enhanced spiritual quality. And if she gets to see this, I'm really sorry she's going to be embarrassed by saying that. But I know that on Christmas when she goes out, that is definitely what I will be thinking.
Tom Holland, thank you so much and happy Christmas.
Thank you.
My new favorite Tom Holland interview. This one was astounding. Just terrific. Can't wait to share my commentary with you all.